Papa was shaking his head. It looked as if he would never stop. I don't understand, he said. So John explained. It started several days ago when I talked to Joachim on the phone. For many years I've tried to trace either a certain Elizabeth or a certain Tebasil. I was convinced that she was one and the same. But it was Joachim who gave me the idea that perhaps Elizabeth was using Tebasil as her last name. I called information in Italy and was given a telephone number in Rome. After a few hours I managed to get her at home, and it didn't take long for her to remember me from those magic days in April of 1961. I told her the story of a mother who had lost a child in 1948. That's how I could tell her who she was. She came to town late yesterday evening. She has not set a foot here since she disappeared that December day 45 years ago. Papa jumped up from the sofa and went to the phone. What is it? Said Mama. I promised to phone Mrs. Hansen as soon as I heard anything. John laughed. Elizabeth stayed with her mother last night. They scarcely closed their eyes, but everything is fine, I assure you. Well, I have to call the police then, insisted Papa, so they can forget that old case about the girl that disappeared. That's been arranged as well, replied John. You can't have read the papers today. You can't have listened to the radio either. The whole country is delighted. Papa sank back into the sofa. There was nothing for him to do. He could only sit and listen to the rest of what John had to tell. May I ask a question? He said. John nodded, of course. Exactly what did happen in December 1948? And don't tell me that Elizabeth set off after a little lamb. Don't tell me she met an angel called Ethereal, either. He turned to Elizabeth and asked her in English. She put her hand to her mouth to hold back an explosion of laughter, and indicated that he should answer. She always begins to laugh when we talk about that, explained John. We can't agree. I'll give you Elizabeth's explanation first. She thinks the police in this town did a very bad job, but I think we should begin at the other end. John stood up and began walking back and forth as he spoke. Now and again he rested his hand on Elizabeth's shoulder. Elizabeth grew up in a little village near Bethlehem. The people there lived of the poor land they tilled, but even this poor land was taken away from them. When I met Elizabeth in Rome in the spring of 1961, she had lived in different refugee camps. First in Jordan, afterwards in Lebanon. She went to Rome to plead the refugees' cause. Well, never mind, we can talk about that later. But Elizabeth really did go to Bethlehem in December 1948. She came to poor, persecuted people who needed God's help. That's what she meant when she said she had been kidnapped by an angel. She meant she had been kidnapped by someone who wanted to help the people in the villages around Bethlehem. She grew up there as a shepherd's girl, so she was able to pet the soft fleece of the little lambs at an early age, just like Elizabeth Hansen in the Magic Advent Calendar. Papa interrupted. So she suddenly disappeared in Rome, he said. Why didn't she want to see you again? I've asked myself that many, many times in the years that have passed. The answer is that she had to be very careful about who she talked to. That was why she turned her name upside down and took Tebasil for her last. We mustn't forget that there was a war in the country she came from. Elizabeth was afraid of being kidnapped again. Go on, said Papa urgently. When I told her I believed her angel story, her suspicions were aroused. She was afraid I might be a dangerous person where her own safety was concerned, and for the Palestinian people. But wasn't Elizabeth Norwegian? Mama wanted to know. John nodded. Yes, she was Norwegian. Elizabeth thinks that she was kidnapped by some very unhappy people who were willing to do almost anything to make the world aware of the suffering of the Palestinians. All the same, it was dreadful to kidnap an innocent child, said Mama. John nodded several times. Of course you're right. Elizabeth thinks they must have intended to take her back. Perhaps the people who kidnapped her wanted to get her father to write in the papers about all the people who were driven from the village to village and finally herded into huge refugee camps outside their own country. So why wasn't she taken back? Interrupted Papa. Elizabeth said she remembers very little until she was looked after by a large family in the tiny village outside Bethlehem. And what is your explanation? Asked Mamma. You know what that is, said John. Joachim was sitting at the edge of his chair. You think she did follow the little lamb with the bell and met the angel Ephraim in the woods? John nodded. I do. No, said Elizabeth. Yes, said John. No, said Elizabeth and laughed. The others began laughing too. You mustn't start arguing, said Joachim. I don't think you should thumb your noses at each other either. I believe Elizabeth's story, said Papa. And what about you? Asked John, looking at Mom and Joachim. I believe 24 times more in John's story, said Joachim. Then I'll have to vote 12 times for John's story and 12 times for Elizabeth's, decided Mamma. Because I think a few angels have flown to Bethlehem this Christmas, and back here again for that matter. But Joachim is right when he says we mustn't start arguing, even though we believe in different things, said John. That's the message of Christmas too. Maybe it's the greatest of all truths, that the glory of heaven is easily shared, at least, if we humans take part in parceling it out. When I wrote on those thin pieces of paper that I folded so carefully and put inside the magic advent calendar, I had a few clues. I'd heard about Elizabeth Hansen, who disappeared, and I had met Basile in Rome. And I had the old angel stories to rely on as well. The rest of it I had to imagine myself. Silence fell in the living room. You managed that very well, Mamma said finally. John smiled shyly. The imagination is also a tiny part of the glory of heaven that has strayed down to earth. It, too, can be shared very easily. It's amazing, said Mamma. We opened the last door in an old advent calendar and heard about Elizabeth who goes into a stable in Bethlehem to welcome the Christ child into the world. Right afterwards, the same Elizabeth rings the doorbell here in our own house, so it seems almost as if this house is the stable where Jesus was born. She stood and embraced Elizabeth. Welcome back to Norway, my dear child, she said. That was a funny thing to say, since Elizabeth was almost 20 years older than Mamma. Thank you very much, said Elizabeth, and she said those words in Norwegian. A little later the phone rang. Papa answered, and Joachim knew right away who he was talking to, because he heard Papa say, We're all overwhelmed. This is the Christmas present of the year, Mrs. Hansen. Yes, now I believe in angels. Here she is, and a Merry Christmas, a very Merry Christmas to all your family. Papa nodded to Elizabeth and gave her the receiver. She spoke in English, so Joachim couldn't understand what she was saying, but he thought it must be strange to talk to your own mother in a foreign language. Before long, Elizabeth and John had to leave, but they would all meet again after Christmas because Mom and Pop and Joachim had been invited to a big Christmas party at Elizabeth's family's home. The guests were escorted to the front door. Outside it was snowing hard. Papa asked whether Elizabeth could remember any Norwegian from when she was small. She stood under the light outside as the snow covered her red coat. Suddenly she bent down and stretched out her hand as if trying to catch the dancing snowflakes. Little lamb, little lamb, little lamb, she said. She bit her lip in alarm and put her hand up to her mouth. The next moment she started running. A few seconds later, she and the old flower seller were gone. Late that evening, when Joachim was going to bed, he stood for a long time in front of his window, staring out into the Christmas night. There'd been a huge new snowfall, but now it was clear enough to see the stars. Suddenly, he saw some figures running by down on the road. It was not so easy to keep his eyes on them, for he could see them only in the light of the street lamps, and the sight lasted only a second or two. Joachim thought he had recognized the angel Ephriel and all the others who had accompanied Elizabeth to Bethlehem. That night, they had escorted her back. And that, my friends, was the last of the Christmas mystery by Jostein Gaarder. We finished it, and we finished the circle with Elizabeth and Joachim. I mean, like lambs. Come on, it has to be fate, right? Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed this journey with me this Advent, this December. And I mean, you can choose whether you believe John's story or Elizabeth's story. I definitely do believe John's. I mean, we all need some angels every now and then. And it's more fun that way. Anyway, I will leave you on this Christmas day to enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the food, enjoy spending time with the people you are with tonight and tomorrow. And a Merry Christmas to you all. And a Happy New Year. I love you all. And I will see you later. Bye.